The mountains do not have a memory, but they have a hunger. Out in the jagged teeth of the crazy mountains in Montana, the air tastes like cold iron and ancient dust. It is a place where the geography seems to shift when you blink, turning a simple ridgeline into a labyrinth of vertical stone and suffocating timber. In September of 2014, a man named Aaron Hedges walked into that labyrinth. He was 38 years old, a father, and a hunter who believed he knew the weight of the wilderness. He carried the confidence of a man who had spent his life navigating the high country, but the high country has a way of stripping that confidence away layer by agonizing layer. I have spent too many years looking at maps of places where people simply cease to exist, and the crazy mountains are a recurring bruise on the landscape of the missing. Aaron was not alone when he started. He was with two friends heading toward a camp near Sunlight Lake. They had pack horses and enough gear to survive a month of harsh Montana weather. But the mountains have a way of whispering bad advice into a man's ear. Aaron decided to strike out on his own to find a different cache of supplies, a move that should have been a routine hike of a few miles. He took a radio, a global positioning system device, and a heavy pack filled with the tools of a seasoned woodsman. He walked away from his companions at the edge of a high meadow, and the last thing they saw was the orange glow of his vest flickering against the deep green of the lodgepole pines. He never made it to the cache. He never made it back to the horses. He simply stepped off the map of the known world. The first few days of the search were a chaotic ballet of helicopters and ground crews. The weather turned sour almost immediately, dropping a thick blanket of snow that turned the world into a monochromatic void. Searchers struggled through drifts that reached their waists, their breath coming in ragged gasps of frozen air. They were looking for a man who should have been easy to find. Aaron was wearing bright clothing and carrying high-end equipment. But the mountains remained silent. The infrared cameras on the helicopters saw nothing but the cold, indifferent heat signatures of elk and the stagnant shadows of the rock faces. It was as if the earth had opened its mouth and swallowed him whole, leaving not a single footprint or a broken twig to mark his passage. When the snow finally began to recede, the searchers found the first piece of the puzzle, and it was a piece that did not fit the frame. They found his fire pit. It was a desperate tiny thing scratched into the dirt beneath a lonely tree. But it was what they found in the ashes that made the hair on their necks stand up. Aaron had burned his own identification. He had burned his hunting license and his personal papers. There is a specific kind of psychological breakdown that happens when the cold gets into your marrow, a state where the brain begins to misfire and the very concept of identity becomes a burden. But Aaron was a hunter. He knew that those papers were his link back to the world of the living. Why would a man burn his name unless he felt that the man who owned that name was already dead? As the investigation ground on the details became even more surreal, they found his water bladder empty and discarded. Then they found his tactical vest. It was tucked away almost neatly, far from where he should have been. The investigators started to notice a pattern that defied the laws of physics and human endurance. Aaron was moving across terrain that should have been impassable for a man on foot in a blizzard. He was crossing ridges that professional climbers would think twice about, and he was doing it while his body was likely shutting down from hypothermia. There is a theory in these cases, a whisper among those of us who study the 411 phenomena, that something else is at play. Something that distorts distance and time, pulling a person along a path that makes no sense to the rational mind. Then came the discovery of the boots. This is where the story leaves the realm of tragedy and enters the territory of the impossible. A rancher miles away from the last known point, and on the opposite side of a massive mountain spine, found Aaron's boots. They were sitting on the ground upright and side by side as if he had just stepped out of them to go to bed. There was no sign of a struggle. There was no blood. There were just the boots, staring up at the sky, in a place Aaron should never have been able to reach. To get there, he would have had to hike over 10 miles through deep snow, barefoot or in socks across jagged shale and frozen scree. No human feet can survive that. No human mind would choose that. The boots were found in an area that had already been searched. This is a recurring theme in these disappearances, the way items appear in places that were previously cleared by professionals. It is as if the landscape is playing a game of hide and seek, with the searchers dropping clues like breadcrumbs long after the trail has gone cold. I have seen photos of those boots, and they look hauntingly discarded, like the shell of an insect that has molted and moved on. But what kind of thing does a man become when he sheds his shoes in a Montana winter? The rancher who found them spoke of a heavy, oppressive feeling in the air, a sense that he was being watched by something that did not have eyes. It took another year for the rest of Aaron Hedges to be found. His remains were discovered even further away in a spot that defied any logical explanation of his movements. He was found on a steep, rocky slope, his bones scattered by the scavengers of the high country. His gear was there too, but it was arranged in a way that felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. The official cause of death was listed as exposure, a clinical term for the long, slow surrender to the cold. But the official reports never mention the impossible distances. They never mention the boots. They never mention the fact that a man with a global positioning system and a radio died less than a mile from a well-traveled road that he seemingly ignored. When you look at the map of the crazy mountains, you see a jagged scar on the face of Montana. It is a place of high peaks and deep, lightless canyons. The locals have stories about the range stories that go back long before the first white settlers arrived with their surveys and their fences. They talk about the little people, or the spirits that mimic the voices of loved ones to lure the unwary into the brush. I do not know if I believe in ghosts, but I believe in the evidence of the absurd. I believe that Aaron Hedges encountered something that day in September that was not a storm and was not a predator. He encountered a tear in the fabric of the world, a place where the rules of survival no longer applied. The cynical part of me wants to say he just got lost and panicked. It happens to the best of them. The heart rate spikes, the vision tunnels, and suddenly the North Star looks like a flickering candle in the wrong window. But panic does not explain the boots. Panic does not explain the burning of the identity. Panic does not explain how a man travels over a mountain range in his socks without leaving a trail of blood on the snow. There is a darkness in the woods that we are not meant to understand. We build our cities and our roads to keep it at bay, but when you step off the pavement and into the shadows of the crazies, you are back in the food chain. And sometimes you are not being hunted for your meat. The case of Aaron Hedges remains a jagged pill for the search and rescue community to swallow. It sits in the files, alongside other names that refuse to be forgotten. Names like Bart Schleyer, a world-class hunter and woodsman who vanished in the Yukon under similarly impossible circumstances, leaving behind gear that looked like it had been dropped from a great height. Or the case of Jared Atadero, whose clothing was found years later, neatly turned inside out and placed on a mountain ledge that no child could ever reach. The patterns are there hidden in the data, waiting for someone to connect the dots. But the dots lead to a place most people are too afraid to go. As the sun sets over the crazy mountains, the shadows stretch out like long, thin fingers reaching for the lowlands. The wind begins to howl through the crags, and if you listen closely, it sounds almost like a human voice calling out a name. But you should never answer. You should never turn toward the sound. Aaron Hedges turned, and he found himself in a world where his boots were no longer necessary, and his name was just something to be burned for warmth. The wilderness is not our friend. It is a vast, indifferent machine that occasionally catches a human soul in its gears and refuses to let go. We find comfort in the idea of a logical world. We want to believe that if we bring enough water, enough fire, and enough technology, we are safe. But the files tell a different story. They tell of men and women who did everything right and still ended up as a collection of bones on a sun-bleached ridge. The mystery of Aaron Hedges is not just about how he died, but about what he became in those final hours. A ghost in his own life, walking barefoot through the snow toward a destination that does not exist on any map we possess. The mountains are still there, waiting for the next hunter to step away from the horses and into the trees. The silence in the crazy mountains is not the absence of sound, it is a presence. It is a weight that presses against your chest until you feel the urge to scream just to prove you are still alive. Aaron Hedges is gone, but the mountain remains, and it is still hungry. We are just visitors in a landscape that was old, before our ancestors learned to walk upright. And sometimes the landscape decides it is time for a visitor to stay forever. The boots are still out there, in the mind of every searcher who has ever looked at a map and realized that the numbers just do not add up. In the end, we are left with the cold facts and the chilling implications. A man went into the woods, and the woods changed him into a riddle. The pattern of the missing 411 is a map of the impossible, a guide to the places where the light does not reach. Aaron Hedges was just one man, but his story is a warning to anyone who thinks they have mastered the wild. The wild cannot be mastered. It can only be survived, and even then, only if it decides to let you go. The pattern continues, the files grow thicker, and the mountains continue to watch us with eyes of stone and ice. This case bears a striking and unsettling resemblance to the disappearance of Danny Philippidis, a firefighter who vanished from a ski resort in New York and reappeared 6 days later in California, still wearing his ski gear and suffering. from a total loss of memory regarding his journey. Or consider the vanishing of Keith Reinhardt in the mountains of Silver Plume, Colorado, who walked into the woods to follow the path of another man who had disappeared years prior, never to be seen again. These stories suggest a terrifying consistency, a predatory phenomenon that targets the capable and the confident, leaving behind only questions that have no answers. The pattern is real, the threat is unseen, and the mountains are never truly empty.